He called her an upgrade. That was the word Daniel Voss used on a Sunday morning in November, standing in his kitchen doorway in his coat, his bag already packed, his decision already made. He looked at his wife of 9 years, 38 years old, 7 months pregnant, still in the clothes she had slept in, and told her, without lowering his voice, that the woman he had been seeing was a richer upgrade. Richer in every sense of the word, he said. Then he walked out to his car, backed out of the driveway, and did not look back. The kitchen was silent except for the sound of rain on the window glass. What Daniel did not know, what no one in his world had known for 14 months, was that the woman he had just left standing in that kitchen was, by net asset value, the single largest private landowner east of the Mississippi River. 380,000 acres across 3 states, $2.1 billion, held inside a Delaware trust his attorneys had never thought to search for because nothing about Eleanor Voss had ever told them to look. And the flagship development project he was so proud of, the one he had been calling his legacy, his arrival, his proof, had been built for 3 years on her land. He had been paying her rent the entire time. This is not simply a story about a man who left his pregnant wife for a woman he considered a better deal. It is a story about what happens when a man mistakes silence for emptiness and spends 9 years building his empire on a foundation he never bothered to read. If you believe that real strength doesn't always announce itself, give this video a like and subscribe so you never miss a story like Eleanor's. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. To understand what Daniel lost the morning he walked out that door, we have to go back, not to that kitchen, not to that rain, but to a farmhouse in Woodstock, Vermont, where a woman named Margaret Hale was quietly, invisibly, building something her daughter would one day inherit. He called her an upgrade. That was the word Daniel Voss used on a Sunday morning in November, standing in his kitchen doorway in his coat, his bag already packed, his decision already made. He looked at his wife of 9 years, 38 years old, 7 months pregnant, still in the clothes she had slept in, and told her, without lowering his voice, that the woman he had been seeing was a richer upgrade. Richer in every sense of the word, he said. Then he walked out to his car, backed out of the driveway, and did not look back. The kitchen was silent, except for the sound of rain on the window glass. What Daniel did not know, what no one in his world had known for 14 months, was that the woman he had just left standing in that kitchen was, by net asset value, the single largest private landowner east of the Mississippi River. 380,000 acres across 3 states, $2.1 billion, held inside a Delaware trust his attorneys had never thought to search for because nothing about Eleanor Voss had ever told them to look. And the flagship development project he was so proud of, the one he had been calling his legacy, his arrival, his proof, had been built for 3 years on her land. He had been paying her rent the entire time. This is not simply a story about a man who left his pregnant wife for a woman he considered a better deal. It is a story about what happens when a man mistakes silence for emptiness and spends 9 years building his empire on a foundation he never bothered to read. If you believe that real strength doesn't always announce itself, give this video a like and subscribe so you never miss a story like Eleanor's. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. To understand what Daniel lost the morning he walked out that door, we have to go back. Not to that kitchen, not to that rain, but to a farmhouse in Woodstock, Vermont, where a woman named Margaret Hale was quietly, invisibly, building something her daughter would one day inherit. But first, 3 weeks before that Sunday morning, there was a dinner. The Meridian Club occupied the 4th floor of a building on Trumbull Street that had been deciding who belonged and who didn't since 1931. Its private dining rooms were small and close, paneled in dark wood, lit with the amber certainty of people who had never needed to explain themselves. Eleanor had been here 4 times in 9 years of marriage. She had never once felt that the room was meant for her. She arrived at 7:15 alone because Daniel had texted at 6:45 to say he and his mother had already left and she should meet them there. Her ankles were swollen enough that she had changed her shoes twice. The navy wrap dress, the one she had worn to the Voss family Christmas 2 years ago, and the Riverside Commons groundbreaking last spring was the only dress she owned that still closed comfortably over her stomach. She had not thought about this until she was already in the elevator. She did not think about it long. Daniel was at the far end of the table when she entered, already laughing, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled in the way he did when he wanted a room to see how comfortable he was in it. Beside him sat a woman Eleanor had not met, introduced when Eleanor reached her seat as Priya Landon, a consultant working with the Riverside Commons financing team. Priya was sharp-featured and composed, dressed in a way that communicated effortlessness at considerable expense. Her laugh, when Daniel said something Eleanor didn't catch, arrived half a second after everyone else's. Eleanor sat at the foot of the table. Constance Voss sat to her left. The room smelled of wood smoke and the particular warmth of plates that had already arrived for everyone except her. She unfolded her napkin. She reached for the water glass. Constance, who had been watching from the moment Eleanor walked in, let her eyes travel once, unhurriedly, from the hem of the navy dress to Eleanor's collarbone before returning to her own glass. Then she leaned close, her voice carrying the pleasant register Eleanor had learned, across 9 years, to distrust above all others. Priya has her own portfolio, Constance said, as though observing that it had begun to rain. I don't think you've ever really understood what a man like Daniel needs beside him. Eleanor's hands were still in her lap. She did not move them. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that Constance would hear, and because she had learned early and thoroughly that Constance's pleasantness was the most dangerous register she possessed. To answer it directly was to drown in a conversation that had no bottom. She rested her palm on her stomach instead. The baby shifted once, quietly, and was still. The dinner continued for 2 hours. Eleanor ate most of her meal. She answered questions when asked and did not ask questions of her own. She watched Daniel refill Priya's wine without being asked and noticed that he did not look at Eleanor once across the full length of the table. Not once. Not to check whether she needed anything. Not to include her in a story he told to the group. Not even by accident. The irony was sharp enough to cut, because what no one at that table knew, what Daniel would not know until a Hartford courtroom made it impossible to unknow, was that the quiet woman at the foot of the table, in the dress she had worn 3 times, with her swollen ankles and her untouched wine, was the largest private landowner east of the Mississippi River. Hale Meridian LLC, 380,000 acres, $2.1 billion in assessed value, held in a Delaware trust under a name none of them had ever thought to search. She had known since she was 22. She had told no one, especially not Daniel. On the drive home, she passed the Riverside Commons site on the way to the highway, the steel skeleton of it rising above the tree line on Asylum Street, lit white and cold against the November dark. She looked at it through the rain. She drove on. 3 weeks later, he came down the stairs with the large bag, the one with the combination lock. She stood at the kitchen window after his car disappeared. Her hands were at her sides. Her breathing was even. Something had finished inside her. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but completely, the way a door closes in an empty house. She did not call her sister. She did not call her closest friend, Rachel Huang, who would have driven from New Haven without being asked. She picked up her phone and found the number she had dialed 6 months ago, the first time when she found the hotel receipt. Simone Park answered on the second ring. Eleanor's voice when she spoke was steady as the land outside Woodstock in November. "It's time," she said. "All of it." Margaret Hale had never once described herself as wealthy. That was the first thing Eleanor understood about her mother, and the last thing she fully appreciated until she was standing in a hospice room in Woodstock, Vermont, watching a woman who owned 380,000 acres of American soil sign her name one final time on a succession document, with hands that had grown thin but remained perfectly steady. The scene softened into something quieter as the narrator takes us back further, back past the hospice, past Eleanor's childhood, back to the specific kind of beginning that explains everything that follows. Margaret Hale grew up in eastern Vermont, the daughter of a land surveyor who taught her to read topographical maps before she could read novels, and who told her, with the precision of a man who had spent his life measuring things, that the country's most undervalued asset was the ground people walked on without looking down. She took his lesson seriously. She earned a graduate degree in environmental geography from the University of Vermont in 1979, worked 3 years for the state agricultural board, and began buying land at 31. Not dramatically, not all at once, but parcel by parcel, the way a patient woman collects something she intends to keep. A 200-acre farm in Pomfret, Connecticut, a 900-acre timber holding in Caledonia County, a 194-acre watershed parcel in the Hudson Valley that 3 separate developers had dismissed as too remote and too wet to build on, and which Margaret purchased for $340,000 in 1987 through a regional LLC called Meridian Land Partners. She never bought in her own name. She never announced a purchase. She never attended an industry event or spoke to a reporter or allowed her photograph in any document connected to the acquisitions. When her colleagues at the Agricultural Board asked about her weekends, she said she gardened. She was not being coy. She was being her father's daughter. Eleanor was 10 years old when Margaret sat with her at the kitchen table in Woodstock. The same table, the same kitchen, and explained what the family owned. Not as a lesson in wealth, as a lesson in responsibility. She spread a hand-drawn map across the table, parcels outlined in pencil, each one numbered and labeled in her careful script. She said, "Everything here was bought quietly, and that is the only reason it is still ours. The woman who shows her hand loses the table." Eleanor had nodded, the way a 10-year-old nods at something she does not yet understand, but will remember forever. She remembered it at 22, when Margaret sat her down again. This time in the offices of Park & Ellison LLP on Park Avenue in New York, across a conference table from a woman named Simone Park, who set 3 bound documents in front of Eleanor without preamble, and explained in the unhurried shorthand of someone who has covered this ground many times, that Hale Meridian LLC held 380,000 acres across Connecticut, Vermont, and the Hudson Valley, assessed at approximately $1.4 billion at current market value, held in trust for Eleanor as sole beneficiary and future managing member. The prenuptial protections were already drafted. Margaret had insisted on this, 5 years before Eleanor met anyone she might consider marrying. Hale Meridian was entirely premarital, entirely separate property, legally airtight under the statutes of every state in which it held land. Simone slid a pen across the table and said, "Your mother has been planning this since you were 12. Read all 3 documents, then sign." Eleanor remembered the philosophy again at 28 when Margaret's diagnosis arrived. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The doctors in Burlington gave her 14 months and she treated this information the way she treated all information, as data that required a response, not a grief that required an audience. She accelerated the succession documentation. She completed the final transfer of Hale Meridian's managing membership to Eleanor in March, 2 months before she died, in that hospice room with the window looking out over the river valley that was her first and largest holding. She handed Eleanor the signed document and said, with the directness that had defined every conversation they had ever had, "Don't mourn me. Manage what I built." Eleanor held those words for a long time after the room went quiet. She was also, by that point, married. She had met Daniel Voss at a Conservation Land Trust dinner in Hartford in the spring of her 29th year. He was 33, mid-level in the commercial development world, ambitious in the way that reads as energy before it reads as anything else. He had asked about her work with the Land Trust. She had been consulting part-time, keeping her connection to her mother's field alive, and listened, genuinely listened, with his elbows on the table and his eyes on her face. She had not experienced that particular attention from many people. She found she was not immune to it. They married 2 years later. It was a small ceremony in Woodstock. Margaret attended in a wheelchair and said nothing cruel about Daniel, which was the most generous thing she could offer. Eleanor chose not to tell Daniel about Hale Meridian, and this choice, she would later recognize, was not calculation. It was her mother's nature, living inside her like a second skeleton. Some things you hold quietly, not to deceive, simply because showing your hand changes the game before you are ready to play it. Daniel never asked what Eleanor was worth. He had looked at her 6-year-old Volvo and her 3-dinner dress and her state conservation consulting salary, and decided he understood the answer. He did not understand the answer. And here the story sharpens into something the audience has been waiting to hear since the first mention of Riverside Commons. In the spring of 2021, Voss Capital Group engaged a commercial land broker to secure a ground lease for a 14-acre parcel on Asylum Street in Hartford. The site that would become Riverside Commons, Daniel's flagship mixed-use development. The project he would spend 2 years calling his arrival. The broker identified the parcel's owner as Meridian Land Partners, a Connecticut regional trust. The lease was negotiated through standard channels. The monthly ground rent was set at $34,000. Daniel signed without reading the ownership chain beyond the first page. He did not know that Meridian Land Partners was a Hale Meridian subsidiary. He did not know that Meridian Land Partners was Eleanor. For 3 years every month, Voss Capital Group had been wiring $34,000 into an account that fed ultimately into the trust his wife managed. He had been paying her to build his monument. He had never noticed. There was no reason he would. She drove a 6-year-old Volvo. She wore the same dress to dinner 3 times. She had, in his estimation, never really understood what a man like him needed. The irony does not announce itself. It simply sits there, accumulating interest, the way the land always had. Those first years of marriage had been real. That is the thing the narrator will not let the audience forget. Daniel had been kind in the beginning. He had been present. He had driven Eleanor to Woodstock after Margaret's funeral and held her hand in the car for 2 hours without speaking, which was the exact right thing to do, and the last time he would do the exact right thing for a very long time. Something in him had shifted as the company grew. As the rooms he entered began to reflect his name back to him with increasing frequency, as the gap between who he had been and who he believed he deserved to become widened into something he needed to fill with a different kind of woman. The Daniel who signed the Riverside Commons ground lease was not the Daniel Eleanor had married. He was a man in the process of deciding she was furniture, and she was, at that moment, the owner of the ground he was building on. The narrator pauses there. The marriage that had begun with warmth was about to grow cold in ways that Daniel would orchestrate deliberately, and Eleanor would endure in the particular silence of a woman who was not yet ready to show her hand. That is the story the next chapter holds. The question it answers is not whether Eleanor would survive what came next. It is how much she would be asked to absorb before she decided she had been patient long enough. The erosion of a marriage rarely begins with a single crack. It begins with a conversation that ends half a sentence too early, a glance held a moment too long in the wrong direction, a chair not pulled out, a question not asked. It begins with things so small that to name them aloud would sound like madness. And that smallness is precisely the point, because small things cannot be confronted, cannot be filed, cannot be held up in a room and examined. They accumulate instead, the way silt accumulates at the bottom of a river, invisible until the water level drops, and suddenly you can see how much has settled. The water began dropping in the spring of what would be the 7th year of the Voss marriage. It started at a dinner, a work dinner. 6 of Daniel's colleagues from Voss Capital Group around the long table at a restaurant on Pearl Street called Oleander, the kind of place where the lighting was expensive and the portions were small. Eleanor had ordered the salmon. She was describing something she had read about soil moisture levels in the Connecticut River watershed, a topic she still followed, still cared about, the professional self she had set aside for marriage hovering at the edges of dinner conversation like a language she spoke only at home. She was mid-sentence when Daniel said pleasantly, the way one might redirect a child who has spoken out of turn, "Eleanor's always been interested in the outdoors." He smiled at the table. The table smiled back. The conversation moved on. She did not finish her sentence. She told herself it was nothing. She was probably being sensitive. It happened again 3 weeks later, then twice in a single month, each time slightly smoother, slightly more practiced. He began speaking for her at social events before she had spoken, finishing her answers, redirecting her observations, shaping her into a simpler version of herself that fit more cleanly into the rooms he was trying to occupy. She noticed it the way you notice a slow change in temperature. Not the moment it starts, only when you realize you have been cold for some time. Then came the finances. Daniel framed it as efficiency. He sat down with Eleanor in the kitchen one evening in April with a yellow legal pad and explained that the household accounts would be consolidated under his management. One joint account, one monthly transfer, a clean system for a busy couple. He wrote the number at the top of the pad, $8,400 per month. His handwriting was precise. Eleanor looked at the number and said nothing, because what was there to say? That it was a generous amount, that she understood the logic, that she had not told him about the Fidelity account that received $2.3 million every quarter and had been sitting untouched since she was 22? She signed the consolidation form. She did not mention Hail Meridian. She thought of her mother briefly, and then she thought of something else. Constance accelerated in direct proportion to Daniel's confidence, the way a second instrument joins a melody it has been waiting to play. She began appearing at the Avon House on Sunday afternoons with the frequency of a standing appointment. Always cheerful, always helpful, always carrying something in a paper bag from a specialty shop that underlined, by its very specificity, the places Eleanor did not shop and the things Eleanor did not think to buy. She began making observations about Eleanor to Daniel within Eleanor's range of hearing, as though Eleanor were furniture that had not yet learned to listen. At a family lunch in June, Constance said to Daniel, while Eleanor stood 4 feet away refilling water glasses, "She's a sweet girl. She's just never really been curious about the world, has she?" Daniel did not disagree. He did not look up from his phone. Eleanor's hand tightened on the water pitcher until her knuckles whitened. Then she set it down and went back to the kitchen. And then there was a name that began appearing at the edges of Constance's sentences, dropped with the careful naturalness of something placed rather than mentioned. Priya, a woman Constance had met at a charity board event. Priya Landon, terribly accomplished, venture capital. Isn't she impressive? Eleanor heard the name 3 times before she understood what the repetition was. The doubt arrived in the way it always does, pointed inward before it turned outward. Eleanor began wondering if she was too quiet, too still, if her modesty, which had always felt like her mother's gift, had calcified over years into something that looked, from the outside, like absence. She accommodated. She asked Daniel more questions about his work, attended events she would previously have declined, wore a different dress to the Christmas function. Not the navy wrap, a new one, blue-gray with a structured shoulder that she had bought on a Tuesday afternoon and worn once. Daniel glanced at it when she came downstairs, said nothing, and checked his watch. She stopped trying to be louder. She simply kept going. The receipt was in his laptop bag on a Tuesday in June, tucked into the front pocket behind a folded boarding pass for a Phoenix flight that matched the Scottsdale trip he had taken the previous March. The trip she had not been invited on, the one he had described twice as a solo site visit for the Riverside Commons zoning review. It was a hotel receipt, the Grand Hyatt Scottsdale. 2 nights, 1 room. The dates aligned exactly. The room rate was $480 a night. Eleanor stood at the kitchen counter holding it. Something moved through her chest, slow and complete, like a key turning in a lock that had been installed years ago and never used. Not shock, recognition. The kind that comes not as new information, but as confirmation of what the body had already understood, and the mind had been too loyal to accept. She did not go upstairs. She did not pour a glass of water. She did not sit down. She called Simone Park. Simone answered on the second ring. Eleanor told her what she had found. She was precise. The hotel name, the dates, the amount, the discrepancy with the stated itinerary. There was a pause on the line that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Simone said, "Say nothing to him. Document the receipt. I'll start the file." That was the entire conversation. Eleanor took a photograph of the receipt with her phone. She folded it back exactly as she had found it, the same crease, the same tuck behind the boarding pass, and placed it back in the laptop bag's front pocket. She closed the zipper. She set the bag back against the wall where Daniel had left it. Then she straightened up, smoothed her cardigan, and went to start dinner. The woman who shows her hand loses the table. She had not shown her hand. She was not yet ready to. But Daniel, watching her move quietly around the kitchen that evening, unhurried, unreadable, mistook her stillness for surrender. He had mistaken it, the narrator notes, for a very long time. And because he believed she had nothing, no resources, no counsel, no counter-move, he stopped being careful. He stopped being cautious. He began to move toward the structural. And that, as Eleanor would one day understand, was the step that made everything that followed not just possible, but inevitable. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears the clothing of administration. It does not raise its voice. It does not leave marks. It arrives in the form of canceled cards and formal letters and conversations held in a reasonable tone, and it is designed, consciously or not, to make the person on the receiving end feel that they are the problem, that their distress is disproportionate, that to object is to confirm the very instability being alleged. Daniel moved from private diminishment to structural control in the last week of July, and he did it the way he did everything, efficiently and without looking Eleanor in the eye. She discovered it on a Tuesday morning at the Stop and Shop on New Britain Avenue, 26 weeks pregnant, a basket of groceries on her arm, orange juice, yogurt, the specific brand of crackers her body had been tolerating without complaint. The cashier, a teenager named Marcus with a faded lanyard, ran the card twice, declined both times. He looked at Eleanor with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered this news several times a shift, and Eleanor stood at the register with people behind her in line and felt the particular heat of a humiliation that has been arranged rather than accidentally stumbled into. She paid with a card from her personal account, the Fidelity account that drew from Hale Meridian's operational reserve, the account whose existence Daniel did not know, and walked to her car in the parking lot and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and her breath moving carefully through her chest. When she raised it with Daniel that evening, he was already at his laptop, already mid-sentence with someone else. He glanced up. He said he had consolidated the accounts for efficiency and that the joint card had been canceled as part of the restructure. He said it the way a man describes a software update. He said he had set up a monthly transfer, the same $8,400 she had been receiving, and that it would arrive on the first of the month. He said, "You don't really have many expenses right now anyway." Then he looked back at his screen. Eleanor said nothing. She went upstairs. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from a firm called Wentworth and Greer LLP, not Daniel's regular counsel, but a second firm she had not encountered before, addressed to Eleanor Voss and advising her, in the measured language of legal correspondence, that any attempt to contest asset arrangements during the current period of marital uncertainty would be inadvisable. The letter cited, in its second paragraph, concerns about Eleanor's emotional stability during pregnancy and suggested that decisions made under such circumstances might not reflect her long-term interests. It recommended she consider the situation carefully before engaging counsel of her own. She read it twice. Then she photographed it, front and back, and emailed the images to Simone Park with a single line, adding to file. Simone's reply came within the hour. 3 sentences. Noted, this is now part of the record. Do not respond to Wentworth and Greer directly. Eleanor did not respond to Wentworth and Greer directly. The instability narrative had been Constance's contribution. The narrator notes, a thread the older woman had been weaving carefully for weeks before the letter arrived to give it legal clothing. Eleanor learned this from her friend Rachel Huang, who called on a Thursday evening and said, with the careful gentleness of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have, that she had been at a lunch the previous week, a charity committee lunch at the Hartford Club, and that Constance had spoken about Eleanor to 2 women at the table, that Eleanor was not managing well, that the pregnancy had been difficult on her emotionally, that Daniel was doing his best, but it was a challenging situation for everyone involved. Rachel paused. Then she said, "I thought you should know what's being said." Eleanor thanked her. She kept her voice even. She set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a moment, one hand on the edge of the counter and one hand resting on the full, round curve of her stomach. And she thought about what it costs a person to build a narrative about someone else's mind. To take a woman's grief, for her dead mother, for her deteriorating marriage, for the 1,000 small losses of the past 18 months, and present it as evidence of unreliability. It was a particular kind of theft, not of money or property, but of testimony. If Eleanor were fragile, her account of events could be discounted. If she were unstable, her silence could be reframed as confusion and her choices as incapacity. She called Simone and added Rachel's account to the file. Priya Landon, meanwhile, had begun appearing at Voss Capital Group events with a frequency that had moved past consulting and into something else. She was photographed at the Riverside Commons construction preview in August, a hard hat event on Asylum Street, investors and press, Daniel at the center of it, standing 2 people away from Daniel in a group shot that appeared in the Hartford Business Journal's online edition the following Monday. Eleanor saw the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the browser. The OB appointment was a Thursday in late September. Dr. Priya Mehta, a coincidence of first names that Eleanor found darkly amusing, ran the standard 32-week checks with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and found every patient's results genuinely interesting. The baby was positioned well. The heartbeat was strong. Eleanor lay on the examination table with her rounded stomach exposed under the fluorescent lights and stared at the ceiling tile and thought about what it meant to be 31 weeks pregnant and financially isolated in the visible layer of her life, with a husband who had her card canceled, an attorney on the other side building a paper case for her incompetence, and a mother-in-law conducting a quiet social campaign against her credibility. The scene settled into something quieter as Dr. Mehta printed the sonogram and handed it over with a steady smile. In the waiting room afterward, Eleanor sat in a chair by the window with her coat folded in her lap. She opened her phone. She navigated to the Fidelity account. Not the joint account, not the household account, but the other one. The one with the specific routing number she had memorized at 22 in a conference room at Park & Ellison LLP, while Simone slid documents across the table. The Hale Meridian quarterly distribution had processed 4 days ago, $2,312,000. Untouched, compounding quietly, the way land always had. Eleanor closed the app. She folded her phone into her coat pocket. Across the waiting room, a nurse called a name that was not hers, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded over her stomach and waited for her own. She did not feel rescued by the number. She did not feel powerful. She felt, if anything, the particular steadiness of a woman who knows exactly what the ground beneath her is worth and has chosen for now to let other people keep walking on it without looking down. The moment for looking down was coming. It was not yet here. That evening she called Simone and asked her to add the bank cancellation, the Wentworth and Greer letter, and Rachel's account of Constance's lunch conversation to the file, which now occupied 2 binders in Simone's office at Park & Ellison and had been building for 4 months. Noted, Simone said. We're ready when you are. Eleanor said, not yet. She was not yet ready to show her hand, but she was beginning for the first time to feel the table beneath it. We have been here before. The narrator brings us back now, back to the Meridian Club on Trumbull Street, back to the amber-lit private dining room on the 4th floor, back to the rainy Thursday evening that opened this story. But we are not the same audience that entered this room the first time. We know things now. We know what is in the file at Park & Ellison LLP. We know what Simone Park has been building since June. We know what Constance said at the lunch at the Hartford Club, and what the letter from Wentworth and Greer alleged, and what happened to Eleanor's bank card at the Stop and Shop on New Britain Avenue. We know about the hotel receipt, folded and replaced with precision in the laptop bag's front pocket. We know about the Fidelity account and its $2.3 million quarterly distribution, untouched and patient as standing water. And we know something else, something the narrator withheld the first time and now places in our hands like a key. The Meridian Club, this very building, the 4 floors of mahogany and amber light and old Hartford money, it stands on land. All buildings stand on land. And in 2003, the land beneath 36 Trumbull Street was purchased by a regional trust called Meridian Land Partners at a price of $1.8 million through a commercial real estate broker who never met the buyer in person. The Meridian Club does not own its own foundation. It has been leasing it at $12,000 a month from a trust whose parent entity is Hale Meridian LLC. Eleanor Voss, sitting at the foot of this table with her swollen ankles and her 3-dinner dress, could, in a legal sense, put every person in this room outdoors. She did not know this detail yet. It would surface in Simone's December audit months from now. But the irony does not require her knowledge to exist. Now watch the room again, with everything you know. Eleanor arrived at 7:15, alone, as we have already seen. She found her seat. She unfolded her napkin. Her ankles pressed against the inside of her shoes with the dull, constant ache that had been her background texture for 6 weeks. She was 34 weeks pregnant, and her body carried this fact in every movement. The way she lowered herself into the chair, the way she adjusted her posture to redistribute weight, the way one hand rested almost automatically on the curve of her stomach when she was still. Daniel was at the far end of the table. He did not look up when she sat down. Priya Landon occupied the seat 2 to Daniel's left, not beside him, technically, but positioned with the specific precision of a woman who had thought about where to sit. She was dressed in charcoal gray, structured at the shoulder, the kind of outfit that photographs cleanly and cost considerably. She carried herself with the forward-leaning ease of someone accustomed to being the most financially legible person in any given room. She knew Eleanor was present. She had known from the moment Eleanor walked in. The narrator watched her register it, a brief, almost imperceptible assessment that traveled from Eleanor's dress to her stomach to her shoes before returning to the conversation she was already holding. Then something settled in Priya's posture, a small, private resolution. She had already decided she had won. The table held 8 people besides Eleanor, Daniel, Priya, Constance, and 5 of Daniel's associates from Voss Capital Group. 2 project managers, a financing director named Howard Kell, and 2 younger men whose names Eleanor had heard and not retained because Daniel had never thought to introduce her with enough context for the names to stick. They were all in their various ways watching Daniel. None of them watched Eleanor. She was furniture. Polite, unremarkable furniture. Present because the occasion required a wife, and Daniel still had one, technically. Howard Kell asked Daniel about the Phase 2 permits for Riverside Commons. Daniel talked for 4 minutes without pausing. The table listened with the specific attention of people whose financial interests are attached to the answer. Eleanor listened too, because she always listened, and because she understood, better than anyone at the table, exactly what those permits were worth and exactly whose land they were anchored to. He didn't notice her listening. He never had. Then Constance leaned toward Eleanor. The voice was warm. The eyes were measuring. "Priya has her own portfolio," Constance said pleasantly. "I don't think you've ever really understood what a man like Daniel needs beside him." The table did not hear it. It was delivered at a volume calibrated for Eleanor alone. Constance picked up her wineglass and returned to the conversation on her other side without waiting for a response, because she had never expected one. She had said what she came to say. Eleanor's hands were in her lap. She did not move them. She did not look at Constance. She looked at the candle at the center of the table, a single taper in a low crystal holder, burning with the absolute indifference of fire. And she kept her face still and her breathing even. And she thought about what her mother used to say about certain kinds of people, that they measured everything and understood nothing. Priya, from across the table, caught Eleanor's eye once, just once, and briefly. She did not smile. She simply looked with the composed certainty of a woman reviewing a transaction she considers already complete. And then she turned back to Daniel and said something that made him laugh. His laugh was loud and genuine, the way it used to be in the early years. The laugh Eleanor had fallen in love with, now deployed for someone else in a room Eleanor had driven herself to. She ate her salmon. She drank her water. She answered the one question directed at her. Howard Kell, asking politely whether she was still doing conservation work, and she said no, not currently, and he nodded and moved on. She did not volunteer anything further. She did not perform warmth she did not feel, and she did not perform coldness she did not intend. She was simply present, in the way her mother had always been present in rooms that did not know what to do with her. The dinner ended at 9:20. Chairs scraped. Coats were retrieved. Daniel said he would ride with his mother and that Eleanor was fine to drive. A statement, not a question. She said she was fine to drive. She was. The rain had not stopped. She took the long route home along Asylum Street because something in her needed the specific site of it. The Riverside Commons construction site appeared through the wet windshield, the steel skeleton of it rising in sections against the dark sky, lit by work floods at ground level, massive and unfinished and already impressive. Crane stood motionless, the frame of what would become Daniel's monument, his proof, his monument to his own arrival, stood 30 feet above land that had belonged to Hale Meridian since the year Eleanor was 6 years old. She looked at it through the rain for a long moment. Then she drove on. She pulled into the driveway on Highwood Road in Avon at 9:47. She sat in the car for 2 minutes with the engine off and the keys in her hand, listening to the rain on the roof. Not thinking, not planning. Simply allowing the evening to settle into its proper place in the ledger. One more entry, documented and noted, joining the others. She went inside. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the rail, her body carrying its weight with the patient dignity of a woman who has been doing hard things quietly for a long time. She went into the bedroom. She did not turn on Daniel's lamp. She did not check his side of the closet for signs of absence or presence, did not look at his phone charging on the nightstand, did not perform any of the small investigative rituals of a woman who suspects her husband and has decided to act on suspicion. She knew what she knew. Simone had the file. She lay down. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved once, a slow rotation that Eleanor recognized by now as the precursor to sleep. She did not cry, but something had shifted in her that evening. Not dramatically, not loudly, not in any way that would have been visible to the people at that table. Something had simply finished being patient and started being ready. The two states are almost indistinguishable from the outside. From the inside, there is no confusion at all. The farmhouse in Woodstock had a particular quality of quiet that Eleanor had never found anywhere else. It was not the absence of sound. The Connecticut River Valley made its own sounds. Wind through the tree line, the intermittent call of something in the field at dusk, the creak of a house that had been settling into its foundation since 1887. It was a different kind of quiet. The quiet of a place that had not been asked to perform anything. The quiet of land that simply was, without apology or explanation, the same as it had always been. Eleanor had been here 6 weeks. Her daughter, Clara Margaret Hale, the middle names chosen without consultation, because Daniel had not been present for the naming, and Eleanor had needed to name her something. Slept in the bassinet in the room off the kitchen, the room that had been Eleanor's own as an infant, and her mother's sewing room for 3 decades after that. The bassinet was the same one Margaret had kept in storage in the barn, wrapped in a cotton sheet, waiting with the patient certainty of a woman who believed her daughter would eventually need it. Margaret had been right about most things. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table in the early morning, 6 weeks postpartum, her body still negotiating the terms of its recovery. The deep soreness that lived in her lower back, the slowness in her movements that no amount of willingness could fully override. She wore a cardigan of her mother's, gray and soft with age, that she had found in the hall closet the first week and had not taken off except to wash. She was holding the ceramic mug, the one with the small chip on the handle that Margaret had never seen fit to replace, because the mug worked and replacement was not the point. The kitchen was the same as it had always been, the same oak table, the same window above the sink looking out over the east field, the pasture land running toward the tree line, where the Hale Meridian boundary marker stood in the ground, as it had stood since 1991, a quiet iron post that no one would look at twice, and which marked the edge of 4,200 acres of some of the most valuable undeveloped watershed land in New England. A memory surfaced, slowly, without force, the way things surface in a quiet room. Eleanor was 10 years old at this same table, Margaret spreading the hand-drawn map across the oak surface, parcels numbered in pencil, her voice even and without ceremony. The woman who shows her hand loses the table. Eleanor had nodded. She had not fully understood. She understood it later as concealment, as strategic silence, as the discipline of keeping a secret from a world that would have tried to manage it for her. She had applied it that way for 16 years, had held Hale Meridian quietly, had kept the fidelity accounts separate, had accepted $8,400 a month from a household joint account, without comment, while 2.3 million sat in reserve, compounding, waiting. But sitting in her mother's kitchen at 38 years old, with her daughter breathing softly in the next room, and the postpartum weight of her body settling into the old chair, and the file at Park and Ellison LLP sitting 2 inches thick in Simone's office. Eleanor understood the phrase differently now. Her mother had not meant, be invisible forever. She had meant, choose your moment, not out of cunning, out of care. Show your hand at the right table, in the right room, when the truth serves its actual purpose. Margaret had not built Hale Meridian quietly because she was afraid. She had built it quietly because she understood that real things do not need to announce themselves. They simply need to endure until the moment arrives, when they become undeniable. The moment had arrived. Eleanor set the mug down. She was not agitated. That was the thing that would have surprised people who had watched the last 18 months of her life. The canceled card, the Wentworth and Greer letter, the dinner at the Meridian Club, the Sunday morning with the packed bag, and the word upgrade delivered in her own kitchen. She was not agitated. She was not gathering anger like a resource to spend. She was simply clear. The way a room becomes clear when someone finally opens a window. The way a calculation becomes clear when you have all the variables and need only to run it. She went through the file in her mind, the way she might review a survey before signing. The hotel receipt, photographed and transmitted to Simone in June, now labeled Exhibit C. The bank cancellation, documented and dated, Exhibit E. The Wentworth and Greer letter with its mendacious second paragraph, Exhibit F. Rachel Huang's account of Constance's lunch performance, provided in writing at Simone's request, Exhibit G. The Riverside Commons ground lease, traced to its source through Meridian Land Partners, connecting to Hale Meridian LLC by a chain of 4 documents that Simone had assembled with the unhurried precision of a woman who had done this kind of work for 30 years and trusted the architecture of the law. 2 binders, everything documented, nothing improvised. She picked up her phone. It was 6:47 in the morning. Simone Park answered on the second ring. Because Simone had always been an early riser, and because she had, Eleanor suspected, been expecting this call for some time. "It's Eleanor." "I know." A pause, the sound of a chair. "Are you ready?" "File it," Eleanor said. "Everything." There was a brief silence. Not hesitation, but the silence of a person confirming an instruction of wait. Then Simone said, "The Riverside Commons ground lease documentation is fully prepared. I'll file the dissolution petition and the asset disclosure simultaneously. You'll be formally served on Daniel's End within 72 hours. Another pause. "Are you certain?" Eleanor looked out the window above the sink. The east field was gray in the early morning light, the grass still wet from the night, the tree line at the far edge of the property standing dark and unhurried against the pale sky. The iron marker was out there, invisible at this distance, exactly where Margaret had put it. "Yes," Eleanor said. The call ended. She held the mug for another moment, both hands, the chip in the handle, pressing gently against her right thumb, the way it always had. She thought of her mother in this chair, in this kitchen, drinking from this mug at 6 in the morning for 30 years, while 380,000 acres quietly held their value in the dark. She thought of the hospice room and the notarized document, and the words delivered with the clarity of a woman who had already said goodbye to everything that needed saying. "Don't mourn me. Manage what I built." She set the mug down. Then she stood, slowly, because her body still asked for slowness, and she had learned, in the last 6 weeks, to give her body what it asked for without apology. And she moved to the window and looked out at the land. The light was beginning now, the gray lifting at the horizon, the east field coming into its color. The tree line held. The iron marker held. The land went on in every direction, the way it had when she was 10, and the way it had before she was born, and the way it would after every person who had ever tried to define her by what they could see of her had finished making their assessments and moved on. In the next room, Clara Margaret Hale made a small sound. Not a cry, just a shift, the sound of a new person adjusting to the particular weight of being alive. And Eleanor turned from the window. The documents were filed. the room where truth becomes visible, was waiting, and Eleanor was ready to walk into it. The courtroom on the third floor of the Hartford Family Court building was smaller than the occasion deserved. It held 2 counsel tables, a judge's bench, a gallery of 6 rows that was half occupied on this particular Tuesday morning in November, and the particular kind of fluorescent light that flattens everything it touches. Faces, expressions, the small, meaningful movements of people who are trying not to show what they are feeling. Eleanor sat at the left table with Simone Park beside her. 5 weeks postpartum, her body still carrying its recovery in the set of her shoulders and the deliberate way she moved. She wore a dark wool blazer over a cream blouse, her hair pulled back with the simple efficiency of someone who had not spent the morning thinking about her appearance. She had spent the morning feeding Clara. She had driven herself to Hartford. She had arrived 8 minutes early and sat in the parking structure for 6 of them, looking at nothing in particular, her hands in her lap. She was ready. Across the aisle, Daniel sat with his legal team from Crandall Forsyth LLP. His lead attorney, a man named Jeffrey Mast, who had been doing family asset litigation for 22 years, and who wore his confidence the way expensive suits wear their fabric, without effort and without question. Mast had 2 associates arranged beside him, a stack of tabbed documents, and the specific ease of a man who had reviewed the opposition and found nothing of consequence. They had researched Eleanor Voss thoroughly. The house in Avon, 2 investment accounts, combined value $1.1 million, a 6-year-old vehicle, no professional income for 3 years, no independent assets of note. There was not much to find. Mast presented the proposal first. Equitable division under Connecticut statute, the house, the accounts, Daniel's Voss Capital Group stake, assessed at $2.8 million, the total package calculated at $4.2 million. His tone was the tone of a man wrapping up a matter that had already been decided. He used the word straightforward twice. He set his pen down when he finished, the way people set things down when they are not planning to pick them up again. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Ellsworth, looked at Simone. Counsel for the respondent. Simone stood. She did not open with a speech. She did not address Jeffrey Mast or look at Daniel. She placed a bound document set on the table in front of the judge and a parallel set in front of Mast's team, with the calm efficiency of someone who has organized the same action in her mind many times and is now simply executing it. Your Honor, respondent submits the portfolio documentation for Hale Meridian LLC, a Delaware land trust of which Eleanor Margaret Hale, not Eleanor Voss, is the sole beneficiary and managing member. The name landed quietly. Eleanor Margaret Hale, not the name on the marriage certificate, the name on the trust, the name on 380,000 acres. On every legal filing, on every land registry record in 3 states, she had always been Margaret Hale's daughter first. The marriage had changed her social name. It had not touched anything else. Mast opened the document. His associate opened his copy simultaneously. The room held its breath in the specific way rooms hold breath. Not silence exactly, but a cessation of small movements. The turning of pages, then more turning, then a pause in which Jeffrey Mast, 22 years of family asset litigation behind him, read a number that rearranged the furniture of the entire proceeding. 380,000 acres. Connecticut, Vermont, the Hudson Valley. Current assessed value, $2.1 billion. Premarital inheritance, 0 marital commingling. Fully exempt from division under Connecticut Statute 46B 81. He read it again. The second reading was slower. Judge Ellsworth looked up from her own copy. Something had shifted in the room. The way the air shifts in a space when its proportions change. When what you thought was a ceiling turns out to be a floor. Daniel had not moved. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. His face had gone through something in the 30 seconds since Simone began speaking. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but the particular stillness of a man whose internal architecture is being quietly demolished floor by floor. He was staring at the document in front of Mast without reaching for it. He was not ready to touch it. Simone's voice did not change register. It never did. Your Honor, respondent submits a second filing. She placed another bound set on the bench, parallel copies to Mast's team. She waited while the pages were found. Voss Capital Group's Hartford development, Riverside Commons, currently under active construction at 1140 Asylum Street, occupies 14 acres of land held by Hale Meridian LLC since 1987. The ground lease, signed by Mr. Voss in March 2021, identifies the lessor as Meridian Land Partners. Meridian Land Partners is a Connecticut subsidiary of Hale Meridian LLC. Mr. Voss has been remitting ground rent of $34,000 monthly to a Hale Meridian account for 37 consecutive months. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of procedure, the silence of a fact that has just rendered everything else in the room a different size. Mast set his pen down again, but differently this time. One of his associates leaned toward him and said something in a voice too low to carry. Mast did not respond. He was reading the ground lease. His jaw had acquired a particular set, the set of a man doing arithmetic he does not want to complete. Daniel looked up from the table. He looked at Eleanor. It was the first time in this room that he had looked at her directly. Not a glance, not a functional assessment, but a full look. The kind he used to give her across the kitchen table in the early years, when she said something that surprised him. He looked at her the way a person looks at a landscape they have crossed 100 times and suddenly understood they have been reading wrong the entire time. There was no performance in it. There was only recognition. The terrible, irreversible kind. Eleanor returned his gaze. She did not look away. She did not offer him anything. Not comfort, not satisfaction, not the small mercy of dropping her eyes. She simply met him, steadily, in the place where the truth had finally arrived. Simone placed the third document on the bench without pausing. The ground lease contains a renewal clause. Hale Meridian LLC holds the right to decline renewal at the upcoming term, which falls in 14 months. Voss Capital Group's construction liability on the Riverside Commons site is currently estimated at $140 million. The project's financing structure, provided by Canfield Capital Partners, includes a land security provision that is now subject to review. Mast's voice, when it finally came, was controlled but thinned. Your Honor, we'd request a brief recess to review these filings. Judge Ellsworth looked at Simone. Simone looked at the judge. Respondent does not consent to a recess, Your Honor. The documentation is complete and self-explanatory. Ellsworth considered this for 4 seconds. Then she said, Request denied. We'll proceed. In the corridor behind the courtroom's side door, which had been left fractionally open, a woman's heels moved quickly across the tile floor. Priya Landon's attorney, a younger man named Karsten Webb, who had accompanied her to the proceedings as co-investor counsel, had slipped out during the third document submission. The audience could hear him through the door, his voice low and urgent on the phone. Call me back immediately. The ground lease, yes, the ground lease. Read the lesser entity. Read it carefully. The door swung further open as he moved away down the corridor, and then the sound of his footsteps was gone. The formal consequences came in the measured language of judicial procedure. Asset division recalculated to reflect respondents' separate property holdings. Voss Capital Group stakes subject to revised valuation pending ground lease status. Matter to be continued for supplemental filings within 30 days. Judge Ellsworth delivered each point without inflection, the way a person describes weather. Not because it lacks significance, but because the significance speaks for itself. Daniel had not moved since the second document was placed before him. Eleanor stood. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She did not look at Mast. She did not look at the judge, who was still writing. She looked at Daniel. At the man who had stood in a kitchen doorway with a combination lock bag and told her she was not enough, that he had found something richer, something better, something that fit the world he was building. And she said what she had come to say. Not for him, not for the room, simply because the truth had been waiting 11 months for the right sentence. And this was the sentence. You called her an upgrade. She was shopping in my store. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Simone fell into step beside her without a word. Eleanor did not look back. Behind her, the room was still absorbing the shape of what had just happened. The way a room does when a very large, very quiet thing has finally been named aloud. She did not need to see it. She had built the file for 5 months and filed it 6 weeks ago and driven herself to Hartford this morning, and sat in the parking structure and waited. She had done everything that needed to be done. The corridor was cool and empty. Her heels were quiet on the tile. At the far end, the elevator doors opened and she and Simone stepped in, and the doors closed. And for a moment there was nothing but the hum of the mechanism carrying them down. Simone said, "We'll receive their response within 30 days. Eleanor nodded. That was all there was to say. The world Daniel Voss had built began coming apart within 72 hours of the courtroom. Priya Landon moved first, because Priya had always understood that the first person to exit a deteriorating position loses the least. Her attorney, Karsten Webb, filed the co-investment withdrawal from Riverside Commons on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the hearing. By Thursday afternoon, her publicist had released a 4-sentence statement describing a strategic reorientation of her portfolio toward emerging technology sectors. She did not mention Daniel. She did not mention Riverside Commons. The statement contained no acknowledgement that she had announced the partnership publicly on her own Instagram account 6 weeks earlier, beneath a photograph of the construction site at Golden Hour, captioned with the words, "Building something that lasts." The post was deleted before the statement went out. Canfield Capital Partners, Riverside Commons' primary financing institution, contacted Voss Capital Group's CFO on Friday to flag the land security provision in their agreement. The provision was 3 paragraphs long and had been standard language in the original financing documents. No one at Voss Capital Group had read it with this particular contingency in mind, because no one at Voss Capital Group had known until Tuesday that the contingency existed. Canfield's letter requested written confirmation of the ground lease's renewal status within 30 days. Voss Capital Group did not have confirmation to provide. By the end of the following week, the Hartford Business Journal was running a brief item about financing uncertainty at the Riverside Commons project. It cited sources close to the development. It used the phrase unanticipated title complications, which was, the narrator observes, a remarkably tidy description of the situation. Constance called Eleanor's phone on the Wednesday after the hearing, then again on Thursday, then twice on Friday. Eleanor watched the calls come in and did not answer any of them. There were no voicemails. Constance had never been a woman who left evidence of a position she wasn't certain she could defend. Daniel came to Woodstock on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks after the hearing. He drove himself, which meant he had thought about it beforehand rather than arriving impulsively, which made his appearance more considered and therefore harder to dismiss as merely desperate. Eleanor saw his car from the kitchen window, the same window she had stood at the morning he left with his combination lock bag and the word upgrade on his lips. He parked in the driveway and sat in the car for 4 minutes. Then he got out and stood in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the front door. He did not knock. He waited, in the specific way of a man who has run out of the confidence to act and is hoping the other person will bridge the distance for him. Eleanor opened the door. She held it. She looked at him across the distance of the driveway, and the 9 years, and the packed bag, and the courtroom, and the 72-hour unraveling, and all the small cuts she had cataloged, and all the patience she had spent. And she let him see that she was looking at all of it. He opened his mouth. She didn't hear the words. The narrator notes this not as dramatic effect, but as truth, because some words, arriving too late, simply do not carry the weight they need to carry. She closed the door. She did not slam it. She did not pause for effect. She simply closed it, the way you close something that has finished its purpose, and went back to the kitchen where Clara was awake in her bouncing seat, making the small exploratory sounds of a person who has recently discovered that her hands are interesting. The scene softened into something quieter after that. The weeks that followed moved differently than the months before them. Slower, warmer at the edges. Eleanor's body continued its recovery with the deliberate patience of a physical process that cannot be rushed. The deep soreness receding by degrees, the sleep improving in increments, the particular weight of postpartum exhaustion beginning to lift like a fog that thins before it clears. She walked the east field in the early mornings, Clara in a carrier against her chest. The infant's warm weight a new and specific comfort. The grass was winter gray, the tree line bare, the iron boundary marker standing in the frozen ground at the field's far edge, exactly where Margaret had placed it, She was not celebrating. That is the important thing to understand about this part of the story. There was no triumph in Eleanor's mornings, no satisfaction she permitted herself to perform even in private. What there was something quieter and more durable than triumph. There was the particular freedom of a woman who has stopped carrying a weight that was never hers to carry. The freedom of someone who has finally put something down after a very long walk and can feel, for the first time in years, the full length of her own stride. On a morning in late December, she took the ceramic mug from its shelf deliberately, not because she had forgotten it was there, but because she was ready to hold it with the full awareness of what it meant. Not grief, continuation. Margaret's hands had held this mug every morning for 3 decades in this kitchen, on this land, in this quiet. Eleanor's hands held it now. Clara slept in the next room in the bassinet that had been Eleanor's own. The succession document from Simone sat on the table. All accounts consolidated, all title transfers recorded. The management of Hale Meridian LLC formally and completely in Eleanor Margaret Hale's name. This is what the narrator wants you to understand about Eleanor's silence across the years of this story. It was not weakness. It was not resignation or defeat or the absence of self-worth. It was fidelity to something her mother had built over 40 years and passed down with both hands. The understanding that real power does not need to announce itself, does not need to be seen in order to be absolute, does not diminish in the dark. The woman who shows her hand loses the table. Eleanor had not shown her hand. She had waited for the table that was worth playing at. And when the moment arrived, in a Hartford courtroom, with 2 binders and a quiet attorney and a room full of people who had done their research and found nothing. The truth had done its work without a single raised voice. Daniel left her for a richer upgrade. He did not know when he said it that he was standing on her floor. Eleanor set the mug down on the oak table. She looked out the window at the east field, at the winter light coming flat and clean across the valley, at the land that had been here before her and would be hereafter. The land that her mother's mother had walked and her mother had walked, and that she now walked in the early mornings with her daughter pressed warm against her chest. She said what she needed to say, to the room, to the woman whose philosophy had built everything around her. "I managed what you built, Mama." The kitchen was quiet. Clara breathed. The land held its cold and patient presence beyond the window glass. If Eleanor's story moved something in you tonight, if you have ever been told you were less than you knew yourself to be, leave a comment below and tell us what this meant to you, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. These stories find the people who need them, and we want to know who you are. Outside, the land goes on. It goes on the way it always has, without announcement, without performance, without the need for anyone to witness it in order to be real. 380,000 acres across 3 states, sitting quietly in the winter dark, worth exactly what it has always been worth, waiting for the woman who knows its value to decide what to do with it next. The land goes on, and so does Eleanor.